Hi, everyone. My name is Davis Winkie, and I'm a senior reporter at Military Times, the nation's largest independent national security newsroom. I'm also a National Guard vet. On behalf of our partners at the Texas Tribune, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2022 Texas Tribune Festival and to this conversation, one-on-one with Jason Kander. Jason is an attorney, author, and National Guard veteran of the Afghanistan War. He's also host of the Majority 54 podcast and a politician. Kinda. I'll let him explain that one, which he addressed in his latest book, Invisible Storm, A Soldier's Memoir of Politics and PTSD. Jason, I appreciate you being here today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this, Davis. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. To kick us off here, Invisible Storm is a memoir both of your Afghanistan experiences and of your return home and the way that your time there and the parts of it you didn't deal with impacted you throughout your political career and kind of the way you've reinvented yourself since then. So to kick us off a bit, if you don't mind recapping your Afghanistan deployment a little bit. You know, you were an intelligence officer fresh out of Georgetown Law, but the mission here wasn't what an intel officer usually would get.
Yeah, I mean, it was different. I mean, it's one of those things that you learn when you get to a war zone, which is everybody's just kind of piecing everything together anyway. So when I showed up, I remember the director of U.S. intelligence, who was my boss, was like, okay, well, this is the only intelligence officer I'm going to get for a while. I was a brand new second lieutenant, and I had been sent over there to replace a lieutenant colonel. So as you know, as an Army officer yourself, that is a world of difference. I mean, that is as much as 20 years of service. It's like those two things have nothing to do with each other, but I was who the colonel was going to get. And so they said to me, we have two jobs that we need filled, and you can choose which of these two you want. And the two were, one was an analyst position on the night shift. Information would come in from people who collect it during the day, analyze it, write it up, send it up the chain. And then the second was what I thought was a lot more interesting. I remember at the time I'm 25 years old and pretty convinced I'm bulletproof. And this job was what the colonel sort of referred to as the internal stability guy, it was a new position. And it was somebody to go out and actually gather the information, the intelligence about these people that the Americans were working with, that the general was working with, that the ambassador was working with, that everybody was working with, which is people in the Afghan government who we knew were engaged in extracurricular activities. They were, moonlighting with the Taliban or with Al-Qaeda or with narco trafficking, but we didn't know how much, and we didn't know the extent of it or the details of it. And in order to deal with them, we kind of needed to know who the bad guys were, who were pretending to be good guys, and what were they up to, and how could we prevent it? And we need somebody to analyze it, but we also need somebody to go get the information. And that sounded like the cooler job to me. And I was just, a nothing second lieutenant, but I said, I'd like that job. And so I got that job. And so what I ended up doing was, building relationships, going out, most of the time, just me and my translator, Salam, and meeting with unsavory characters of unknown allegiance. So, on a nearly daily basis, going off post, traveling to meetings, and not knowing whether or not we were walking into a trap. And my boss, the colonel over there, he later told me that he thought of what we did as a thugint, which, for those who are not familiar with, so you're familiar with the way all different forms of intelligence are shortened. Like SIGINT is signals intelligence, HUMINT is human intelligence. There was a made-up term because they were trying to describe what we did, which was thugint, thug intelligence. And he said that, my job was to go out and develop relationships with thugs in order to generate information about other thugs. So that's what I did over there.
Yeah, I think the way you described it in the book was you were the gossip columnist for the G2.
Yeah, that's right. Like I was a gossip columnist in Kevlar. I went out, with my rifle and my pistol and my notepad and my pen, and I made friends with people who I never imagined I'd be making friends with, and wrote down what they told me, and then came back and wrote it up and put it into the database so that like somebody back at Central Command headquarters in Tampa could one day read what some guy had just told me he had heard from somebody else.
In retrospect, you eventually learned that this method of doing this job, which you kind of had to develop on the fly, um, was later discarded for being incredibly dangerous, right?
Yeah, it was several years before I found that out. In fact, it was after I'd already gone to therapy, and I had been telling myself for years that I was just a jerk who went to meetings. Like, I did not think of myself as a combat veteran because I hadn't fired my weapon. But the truth was, in the nature of the job that I was doing, where Salam and I, usually it was just Salam and I, were frequently out there alone. If we had to fire our weapon, like, it was game over, because at that point we already were in a trap. We were ready to shoot our way out, or to attempt to shoot our way out, but never had to. And so, while on the one hand, you're sitting there and you're aware of where all the exits are, you're aware of how many people are between you and your vehicle once you get out of the exit, and you're gaming out every possible scenario. But because it never went down like that, I had told myself, like, you know, this didn't count. Well, in therapy, there was explained back to me, no, you are a combat veteran, and what you did was traumatic. But it wasn't until I reached out to there were two other guys on my post, who were doing similar work to me, and we worked together somewhat often, but we had not remained in touch afterwards. One of them, not long after we got back, took his own life, but we didn't still that didn't connect for us. That maybe that meant that we should think about whether we should get help. And when I reached out to the other guy, his name is Todd. um, he was having the same problems, the same nightmares, everything as me. And he said to me, he was like, he goes, dude, he said, Jason, after we did our work over there, he's like, they changed it completely because the way, what we did was insane. And because he went and did a second deployment, and he saw the teams that were doing what we were doing. And at that point, a couple of years later, like, they weren't allowed to leave the post without armored vehicles. We were just out, you know, bebopping around in little Mitsubishi Pajeros and making friends. It was, I think, very effective for the work we were doing. But at that point, nobody really knew, like, hey, this is crazy, what we're doing.
Yeah, and getting into that survival mindset where you're making a plan to kill everybody in any room that you're in is kind of hard to put down. And that's kind of compounded by the way that our nation's part-time soldiers come home sometimes. Whereas active duty troops, when they come home, usually they've got the people that they deployed with to an extent who are still living and working with them, and there's kind of that togetherness in their transition. But you deployed as a individual augmentee. Can you explain how that, or what that meant, and how it impacted your transition home?
Yeah, like you said, I was a reservist, and I volunteered to deploy. I'd been trained. I had joined the army in order to go and fight. I had been moved to do it because of 9/11, and so I actually, coming out of intelligence school, had trouble finding anybody who would take me. They kept saying, you don't have any experience, and I kept saying, how am I supposed to get experience? And so what I ended up doing is I got myself put on temporary orders down to CENTCOM. And for 3 months before I went to Afghanistan, I was on orders to CENTCOM, just as an intelligence analyst, in Tampa. And then finally, when they needed somebody to rotate forward and fill one of the spots that they usually were responsible for filling, I raised my hand, and that's how I got to deploy. So I had to work very hard to get there in the first place. And then when I came home, like you said, like, I didn't leave, I didn't come home with a bunch of people that I, went over there with. I got to Kansas City International Airport, greeted by my parents, who drove me back to the house, where I surprised my wife, who wasn't expecting me for a couple of weeks, because I had, kind of had a ruse going so that I could surprise her. And that was great. But then the next day it was like, what do I do now? I went to Leavenworth and signed some paperwork saying, okay, I'm coming off active duty and going back to reserve duty. Kind of laid low for like a week or two. Just, the idea was I'll decompress. And then I went back to my job, which was as a corporate attorney at a law firm. So I'd gone from being an intelligence officer, going around Afghanistan, sometimes out of uniform, doing all this hua stuff, to writing legal memos and trying to care about it. And at the same time, starting to have some nightmares, and I had a twitch in my eye like in my eyelid, like a muscle spasm that didn't go away for many months. And then was really uncomfortable initially with crowds. And my wife had to remind me of this actually when I wrote the book. I'd forgotten about it, that at first, like, I really didn't like, it's not that I didn't like getting in a vehicle, it's that I reacted a certain way. Like for the 4 months prior, every time I'd gotten in a vehicle, it was to go outside the wire. And so my body, every time I got into a car, was preparing itself to kill people, and, or to be blown up. And so, for instance, stoplights, like I would get really anxious. It's because, you try not to stop over there. So there was all that, but I just thought all of it was, I was like, oh, this is probably just normal transitioning back period. I didn't take it very seriously at all.
And what kind of support system from the military was available for you and for Diana?
There wasn't one. And I think that for many years, I wanted to think that that was unique to me being an individual augmentee, but I don't think it really is that unique to it. I mean, there's the natural, and you alluded to it, the natural support system of, like, if you're active duty and you come back and you're in, housing on an active duty post, and, your friends are all in the military, all your coworkers, and, there's a certain advantage to that. It doesn't get the job completely done, mind you. But there's two things that were missing. One, there was no period where somebody sat me down and was like, hey, all the stuff that we had taught you from the moment you got into the service about how everything you're doing is no big deal. Like, that was really important so that you'd keep going into those meetings knowing that you might get kidnapped. But actually, you should know, like, that's kind of a big deal. And it's really normal if you need to see somebody over it. Instead, I was never disabused of that. So anytime I was having problems, I was like, but it can't be connected to that, because I've got on a good authority that this was no big deal. But then going way back prior to that, I mean, when you think about all the stuff, like in basic training and in initial entry training of every kind, there's so many mandatory little trainings we go through, really, necessary stuff about ethics and sexual harassment training. And I mean, just, like any other employer, there's stuff that you go through, orientations to different things, stuff like, how to spot heat stroke, like all sorts of stuff. But nobody, at least for me, maybe it's changed. You entered more recently than me. Nobody in initial entry training ever gave me a course on what PTSD was, or what it looked like, or how to spot it. So I had no context for that.
And so after you get home, you're still working to adjust and make sense of a new normal after your deployment. And it's pretty quickly after that you get involved in politics. If you could kind of walk us through those early years of your political career, to help remind the audience, Jason Kander, the politician.
Sure. So I got home from Afghanistan in early 2007. By August of 2007, I was knocking on doors in a race for state representative. I knocked on doors for a year straight. I mean, I've always been a driven person, but now I had this. Now looking back, I can see that I had this thing inside me that was this search for redemption, because I had suffered this trauma, but didn't recognize it as a trauma, and thought, well, the way that I'm going to feel better is if I achieve the right things, if I redeem myself by, making this difference. So I was in a 3-way race for the state legislature in a primary where I was the least known person by far, and everybody figured I'd be an afterthought. But I personally knocked on 20,000 doors, and just, I lost like 15 pounds during that race, and ended up winning a 3-way race with 68% of the vote. And so it sort of catapulted me onto the scene a little bit in state politics to win in that fashion. And not like, it's not like other people knew who I was, but like when I got to Jeff City, people were like, oh, this is the guy I'd heard about, right? Like a small group of people were aware of this dude who had won a race he wasn't really supposed to, and won it pretty handily. But I had done it, by just like working really hard. But looking back, I realized sometimes it's hard to sort out now what was me working hard because I cared about it, and what was me working hard because I wasn't going to be alone with just me and my thoughts, because they were no fun. And so then I served 2 terms in the state house, but really I spent most of the second term running for Secretary of State of Missouri. Again, a race that nobody thought I should have a chance to win. I was a liberal guy from Kansas City running in a statewide race in Missouri against the Speaker Pro Tem of the House, and ended up winning that race. Very close race, but ended up winning that, becoming the first millennial in America ever elected to a statewide office. And then it wasn't long after that that I found myself running for the United States Senate against an incumbent, Roy Blunt, who had literally been in office 9 years longer than I'd been alive, in a red state. And it was in 2016. So Trump won Missouri that year by more than he won Mississippi. He won it by 19 points. But on that same day, we lost by 2.8. So we had outperformed the ticket dramatically. And that got, a lot of notice. And so then, I started a national organization about voter suppression. And that kind of took off, combined with some other things. And, cut to 2018, I'm one of a couple dozen people looking at running for president in 2020. And I'm basically running for president by that point. And all along the way, having night terrors pretty much every night, hypervigilance, which is to say, feeling like I and my family were in danger all the time, which then eventually became some self-loathing and a lot of shame, and eventually depression.
What were some of the key moments along the way where you and Diana realized that something might need to change here? Even before the Vermont speech you talk about in your book.
Yeah. The New Hampshire speech, you mean?
Right.
No, it's I'm just making sure we're on the same page. Interestingly, trivia, Vermont, one of 2 states I've never been to. Three states I've never been to. It's Vermont, Oregon, and Alaska. So if anybody out there in any of those 3 states wants to invite me to come give a speech or something, like, I'm eager to check those off. But so anyway, we knew that we weren't normal, and that I was feeling like we were in danger all the time. I had convinced Diana we were in danger all the time. So she was now living with a lot of the same symptoms that I had, but without the underlying trauma. But we also figured, well, but we're not like other people. Like, we're the most high profile Jewish family in Missouri. So that's probably reason for some concern. So there was always, just like for me, there was always some evidence that I could point to and look at in a certain way, and it would convince me, oh, I must, this must not be related to Afghanistan. There was also always some reason for us to justify our own symptoms, particularly mine, and feel like they must be normal. But then after a while, it was like, we're not even asking the question of whether this is okay, whether this is normal, because this is just what is. I mean, after 10 years, it's like, this is what's going on. I'm in politics. I'm pursuing the presidency at this point. It's not like we're going to go tell somebody about this. So we just kind of suffered alone and apart in many ways. But then for me, the big thing that convinced me, okay, something needs to happen, was the New Hampshire speech. It was a place where I had gotten to really the zenith of my political career. I was the keynote speaker at the McIntyre Shaheen dinner. It's like one of the biggest nights in Democratic politics anywhere, particularly in primary politics, but especially in New Hampshire. To give you an idea, I think the 2 years before me, I think the keynote speakers were like Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton, and the year after me, I think it was Joe Biden. So, it was we're going to decide if this guy's the guy sort of speech, right? And yeah, and it was like live on, national TV. And the thing is, the speech went really well. Like, I crushed it. So everything should have been feeling great. And at this point in my life, I didn't understand much about my mental health, but I did come to a point where I understood, like, I feel good when I'm going. That's how I said it to myself, which was to say, as long as I'm like doing something and moving forward and feeding off this adrenaline, I feel good. So I was stringing these endorphin hits together, big speeches, big interviews, things like that. And this was the biggest. And it went really well. So this should have lasted a long time. Like, I got to the airport the next morning, and the TSA guy looks at my ID, looks at me, and is like, oh, the next president of the United States. So like, I should be feeling great. And I was. And then by the time I took my seat on the plane, so it hadn't even been 12 hours since the speech, I just went back to feeling totally numb and empty. And that, I was like, that's not good. This should last a lot longer. Something might seriously be wrong. And that's when it wasn't long after that I was in Hawaii with my family because I had been invited out there to give a speech to the Hawaii Dims, and we took advantage of the opportunity to, have a little family time. And my campaign manager, Abe, was there, and I said to Abe, what if I didn't run? I told him I was exhausted, and he threw out the idea of, well, I don't think he thought I would take it seriously, but he said, you could go back home to Kansas City instead of flying on airplanes all over the place. You could stay home and run for mayor. And I grabbed it like it was a life raft, because in my mind, what I was going to do was I was going to make a difference in my own community, which I thought was going to make me feel better. I'd been chasing this redemption mirage for a long time, but I also said to myself, I'll go to the VA and I'll get some help. I didn't admit to myself yet it was PTSD, but I was like, maybe they can figure out what it is. So I started running for mayor. I put in some paperwork to go to the VA, but I didn't answer the questions, honestly, because I was, shy about it, timid about it. And so I didn't get accepted for enrollment for service-connected trauma. So I said, okay, I'll just mayor will have to do. And the mayoral campaign was going great. Like, I didn't just have name recognition. I had 100% face recognition. It was like, I'd never been anything but the underdog in a campaign. And now I was like, we were going to win, and by a lot. And it should have felt great. But instead, I just kept getting worse and worse. And now I was getting worse faster. And so to answer your question, I was getting to a point where I was starting to think more often about taking my own life. And I was having these suicidal thoughts while I was breaking records in a mayoral campaign and outraising the other 9 candidates combined, like by a factor of 3. And it was like, should have been fun, but I just was worse and worse all the time. And so finally I said, well, maybe I should try the VA again. So I called the Veterans Crisis Line thinking, well, this will be, they're going to tell me like, hey, this doesn't count. Like, keep this channel clear. But that's not what happened. What happened was they asked, the woman on the phone asked like if I had thoughts of hurting myself. And it was the first person other than Diana I'd said yes to that question to. And I got really emotional. But then the rest of the call, I could tell the way she was talking to me, I didn't sound any different to her than anybody else she'd talked to in that job. And that's when I finally realized like that this was real and it was connected to my service, and that I had PTSD and I needed to address it.
And the way that you described your intake process at the VA in your book was striking in its transparency and honesty. And you had a really grounding moment when you met the psychiatrist for the first time. What stood out about that caused you to include it in the book?
Yeah, I mean, it's the opening to the book, and then the rest of the book, it kind of goes back and then brings you up to that point again in the middle of the book. And it's just because it was a moment of really, and I'll tell the story here in a second, but it was a moment of really, it was a very stark presentation to myself of where things were in my life. And what had happened was I was planning to announce the next day publicly, which I ended up doing, that I was going to drop out of public life for a while and go get help at the VA. And first I had to go to the VA and get enrolled in the system. So I show up and I'm filling out paperwork with a volunteer. And after answering a few questions, they're like, it really seems like you need to see somebody like today. And I was like, yeah, I kind of do. So they take me down to the emergency department. I answer 2 little questions. And because of the way I answered them, they put me in suicide watch and suicide hold. So they take away all my belongings and they give me a pair of like scrubs, like pajamas that are like 4 sizes too big. So I'm sitting there on this like stainless steel like bed. And there's a stainless steel toilet with no lid next to me. It's basically a cell. And the nurse is in the doorway, and like she's like, if you need to pee, I'll turn around, but like I'm not leaving, right? So they take all my belongings away and they say there's a new psych resident on duty and he'll be down in a few minutes to see you. So up until this point throughout the check-in process, it was pretty mortifying because the Senate campaign had been 2 years earlier and $75 million on TV with my face. Since then I'd been on every channel all the time running for president, and everybody recognized me. And that's usually great when you're in politics. It's very helpful. It's not, great when you're in suicide watch at the psych ward, and people aren't like, oh hey, can we get a selfie, but they're being professional, but like you can tell when someone does like a double take because they recognize you. And so it's kind of humiliating. And so when this guy comes down, and within a minute or so I could tell he had no idea who I was, it was like a huge relief. So we talked for like 30 minutes and I outlined all my symptoms and stuff, and then he's actually ready to let me go home because I had said, well, I got to go pick up my son from school. And I think he kind of figured, well, if you're making plans, like you're not going to kill yourself today, we'll let you go. And he asked me though, he was like, by the way, do you have like a particularly stressful career or something? And I said, well, I'm in politics. And he's like, well, what does that mean? Yeah. And I said, well, I didn't like recite my whole resume. I was like, I was going to run for president. And I decided not to. I said, run for mayor instead, but I'm going to call that off tomorrow because I want to come here and get help. And he's like, wait, president of what? And I felt really silly, but I was like, of the United States. And and at this point, like I've gone from being humiliated that other people recognize me to kind of irritated that this guy doesn't believe me. So he's like, well, who told you that you could run for president? And so I just said, I don't know what to tell you, man. Like I spent an hour and a half, just me and Obama in his office, and he seemed to think it was a pretty good idea. And he digests that for a second, and he kind of like taps his pencil on his notebook, his pen on his notebook. And he goes, how often would you say you hear voices? And that was my first day at the VA. And then I ended up, connected with my actual therapist, Nick, who did an incredible job. But yeah.
So in your process with the VA, once you were able to make it in, get enrolled, and get set up with Nick, what's your overall experience been like? And what have you learned about yourself and about the VA system along the way?
So first, the VA gets a really bad reputation, and in some ways it's earned, but it shouldn't be placed on the people at the VA. The system that we've set up in Washington is one where it has organized the entire question of veterans benefits around a question that makes no sense, which is, how do we make sure that nobody receives benefits who doesn't deserve it? And the problem with that is that it starts with the assumption that there are veterans who don't deserve these benefits. And so that's why you have this chutes and ladders, labyrinthine system that you can feel like you're getting up and then bounced out of. And that's what happened to me at first. It was, I apologize. It was very difficult for me to access things at first, which is actually why even I went, who had a lot of connections, but I went to Veterans Community Project, the nonprofit in my town, to get help navigating the system. I didn't get any special treatment. I got the same help that anybody who goes to VCP gets. I was so inspired by it, by the way, that I ended up, now I've spent the last 3 years as the national expansion president for that organization. But once I got into the system, I will tell you that it is the singular best customer service experience I've had anywhere else. Yeah, there are things like, sometimes you have to wait for appointments a little longer than you might wait with a private doctor. There are things like where they have some rules that are frustrating, right? Like where, I've had stuff where like I needed my shoulder looked at and everybody knew I needed an MRI, and then an X-ray wasn't going to show anything, but I had to go do the X-ray first and then wait a couple weeks for the MRI. There's stuff like that because I get most of my healthcare there now. But every individual that I have dealt with, every human being, from the call center to the clinicians, every one of them, it's just the best customer service experience. They're genuinely proud of where they work. They genuinely want to serve veterans, and they're as frustrated by the shortcomings of the system as the patients, easily as frustrated. As far as my PTSD treatment there, outstanding. When I first announced that I was going to go to the VA to get help, a lot of people reached out to me and were like, hey, you have means, like, why would you go to the VA? Or they'd say, hey, I can connect you with this person who is a trauma therapist on the, in the private sector, and I'm sure they're much better than the VA. Now, I didn't know much, but what I had figured out was I wanted to sit across from somebody who talked to people like me every day. And that's really what the VA offers, is that expertise. So Nicholas Heineke, who's still a therapist at the VA PTSD clinic in Kansas City, was assigned as my therapist. Nick was just incredible. I never said anything where Nick was like, "Well, that's weird." I mean, like everything I said in any one of our sessions, he would receive it and then help me understand why I felt the way I felt. And he educated me about my brain and about PTSD, and made an enormous difference in my life, and is a big part of the reason that I'm in this phase of my life that I refer to as post-traumatic growth.
Um, in a previous life, I had organized a veterans writing workshop back when I was in graduate school. Talk to me a little bit about what writing Invisible Storm has done for you, and how does Nick feel about it?
Yeah. What it's done for me is there's a few things. One is giving me the opportunity that I wish everybody who decided to go and get help got, which is just to have this constant affirmation for that decision because of how many people that it's helped or is helping, from people with trauma to people who know people with trauma to just people who wanted to understand it better, to trauma therapists. I mean, I just wish everybody who was open about their own mental health got that level of affirmation. Um, the other thing, I mean, personally, that it's done for me, um, I mean, look, there's drawbacks to like everybody knowing all your stuff. I'm not going to say there's not, but if there's an upside to it, it's that in my case, I dropped out of public life rather abruptly. And when I did, all I really told people was I had PTSD and I had suicidal thoughts. And then people didn't really hear from me for like almost a year. And then when they did, it was kind of like they would hear from me occasionally. I'd go on TV and talk about politics or something, but people didn't really get the rest of that story. And so what that meant was that I could kind of feel this national, not to say everybody was thinking of me, but of those who knew me, this national like pity being sort of placed on me. And sometimes it's confusing. It can feel like if you're being regarded as though you are pitiful, you can feel a little pitiful. And little stuff like my life now is dialed down to a much smaller place where, you know, the other parents of the kids at my kids' school, like oftentimes that's my social circle. And, you're aware that like you're friends with people, but like they have questions and like, is he okay still? So just being able to put this fully formed version of me out there helped me understand my story better. But it also made me feel much better. Like when somebody I know tells me they've read the book, I just feel like, okay, I don't have anything to explain. Like this person knows me now. Um, and so that's to me a real advantage of it.
Yeah. And then you can't dodge this question today. In the epilogue, you talk about how your focus is on the here and now with your kids, with your wife, with your work with VCP, but you don't rule out a return to politics. What do you think may be over the horizon for you, and how important is it for you to leave your options open like that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't dodge the question. For me, it's really simple. It's like it's just not what I want to do right now. And politicians, I used to do it when I was like clearly running for president. I used to say like, well, it's not what I'm thinking about right now, when it was like all I was thinking about at that moment. That's what politicians do. But when I say it's not what I'm thinking about right now, I really mean it. I mean, the difference between me now and me then is I had to live in the future because the present was unbearable, right? I mean, I was inundated with disruptive thoughts and intrusive thoughts, bad memories, and I couldn't sleep at night, and it was, I was having suicidal thoughts. Like living in the future made a lot more sense because it was like it would quiet things. It would quiet the invisible storm in my mind. Whereas now I'm really enjoying my life, and I don't feel that I've got to live in the future in order to get by day to day. I have this job that I love. I have my wife and our two kids, and I love being with my family. Unlike before, where it was very difficult for me to be present with the family, I coach my son's little league team just like my dad coached mine, and his dad coached his. I play baseball on an over 30 wood bat, very serious competitive baseball team, and I love it. And that's what my life's about. And so it's just not something that it's not just not something I'm thinking about right now. It's not something I can imagine doing right now. But I have the luxury of I'm still involved in politics. I still have a political podcast that's pretty popular. Anytime I want to go say something, I can get on TV and say it. I have a platform. I can work on things I care about, like Veterans Community Project. I spent the last year helping rescue 2,000, at-risk Afghans out of the country because I can use my platform to do that, including people I served with. So I'm very happy with where things are. The reason I leave the door open is twofold. One, why not leave the door open one day when my kids are grown or whatever? It's not like I don't think I'd be good at those jobs, president, mayor, whatever. So I'm not going to say I'm never going to do it. But there's a bigger reason that I leave the door open, which is if I tell people, well, no, I'm not interested in that at all anymore, I'm never going to do that. Well, what a lot of people are going to hear is, well, he can't do that because of PTSD. And would that affect my life? Probably not, because if I want to go do those things, I'll have the chance and I'll go do those things. But what about the combat vet or a person who's not a vet who has PTSD, who's applying for any other job, literally any other job? Well, if I'm out there saying that there's something I can't do, and people think that it's because, or something I won't do, and people think it's actually something I can't do because of PTSD, which is not the case. If I've sent that message, well, that's not fair to the person sitting in a job interview who might be stigmatized by a potential employer and not given an opportunity that they're entirely capable of absolutely crushing. So I think it's important that somebody like me say, hell yeah, I could be president, just don't want to right now. I think that's important. And so I'm going to keep saying it that way.
Jason, I did have one last question before we go. Right now the Army is facing the biggest recruiting crisis it has since the draft ended in 1973. While the causes of this shortfall are really complex, 63% of young Americans, according to DoD market research, are worried about the risk of PTSD or psychological injury as a top factor influencing them against joining. What are your thoughts as somebody who's been to war and come back on the risk reward proposition posed by service today?
Look, first thing is, I wouldn't change the decision I made to join. If I could go back, and I had a time machine to do anything with any of that process, the only thing I would do is I would have inserted somebody into the story who had educated me on PTSD prior to my deployment, so that I might have been more likely to go and get help soon after I got back, so that the injury didn't get worse and worse and worse. I mean, frankly, I guess what I'd really have done is just taken the book that I wrote and made it available to me back then. I mean, that's really why I wrote this book, is because I wrote it for somebody who's where I was 14 years ago, and that book just didn't exist. So I needed to write it. Whether they're in the service or not, just anybody who's dealt with trauma. But I think the most important thing that the Army can do to assuage that concern is not try and convince people that they're less likely to have PTSD or try and do damage control, but simply to put things in place to make it more likely that people can be treated for PTSD promptly. One of the greatest misnomers out there that I think costs a lot of people their lives is that PTSD is something that is a terminal diagnosis, that once you get it, that is it. Either your career or your life or both are dead, and you're never going to get better. And the truth is that the vast majority of people who go to trauma therapy get to a point where that trauma is no longer disruptive to their life. It's like any other injury. You go, you treat it, and you move on. I had a knee injury before I went into the Army. I am still pretty darn fast, but I iced my knee afterwards. I know how to manage the injury, but it doesn't keep me from being able to run. PTSD is no different. It's not cured, but I know how to manage it. And it doesn't keep me from doing anything that I want to do. And if we could get that message out there better, and we could prepare people to be able to go in and get treatment and get the help they need, I think just like anything else, doing the right thing here is the best thing to solve this problem.
Well, Jason, I really appreciate your time and perspective today, and looking forward to chatting again sometime soon.
Davis, thanks for the time, man. Thanks for doing this.